All right, U.S. history students, today we're going to talk about America getting involved in World War II. All right, so World War II starts raging in Europe, and America just getting out of World War I, just getting out of the Great Depression and the mess here at home with the economy. Many Americans do not want to get involved, and so America tries to stay neutral in World War II. And so Congress passes what's called the Neutrality Acts. And what these acts did is they kept Americans from traveling on ships of nations that are at war, because we don't want Americans getting killed. We're also not going to sell weapons to countries that are at war. They could sell non-military items, food, things like that, but only on what's called a cash and carry basis. So they had to pay cash for it. We weren't going to let them borrow money, and they had to come get it. We weren't going to send our merchant ships into the war zone. FDR did, however, issue what's called a quarantine speech. The quarantine speech, he basically says that the countries that are not at war, the peaceful countries of the world, need to work together to try to boycott the aggressive countries that are causing war, to basically try to keep them in place and keep them from being too aggressive. Even though America was trying to be neutral in the beginning, there was a group of volunteer American fighters. They were recruited to try to help the Chinese, because the Japanese were invading China, invading their land, Manchuria. And so this group of Americans, known as the Flying Tigers, are sent over to combat the Japanese aircraft. And these Flying Tigers, they destroyed lots of Japanese aircraft, over 300. And they brought much-needed supplies to the Chinese, who were trying to fight off the Japanese. So Americans, we wanted to remain neutral. We did not want to get involved in this fight, but it became more and more evidence that the United States was going to have to get involved. And so the war started in 1939, and we were hoping to avoid war, to stay out of war. But in preparation, because we knew that there was a good chance we were going to get into it, Congress started to increase spending on the Army and the Navy, and they actually enacted a peacetime draft. So we weren't at war yet, but we're going to draft Americans so that we're ready if we need to. So we're going to draft Americans, start training, start preparing in case we need to get into war. And then FDR, during this time period, he ran for a third term as president. So all the turmoil that's going on, he basically said, you know what, I know it's the precedent to only run twice, but there's so much going on, and I'm the best man for this job. I know what's going on, and I've been president, and I need to lead us through this turmoil. So the war starts in 1939. In 1941, things start looking bad for the British. And so the United States, not wanting the British to fall to the Germans, proposed something called the Lend-Lease Act, which means that if there's a country that's at war, that the United States or the president determines that it's very vital that we help them in order to defend ourselves, then the president can lend and lease them war materials. And so we put this into place. We start lending and leasing and sending British war materials to help them fight off the Germans. Even though we're not involved yet, now we have chosen our side. We've jumped in with the British, and we're sending them war materials. Okay? We also are using American battleships to protect British ships that are crossing the Atlantic, trying to protect them from the Germans. And so the United States is becoming actively involved in World War II, even though we have not declared war yet. So before the U.S. gets involved in war, it's still 1941, FDR, he makes an announcement, makes a speech that he hopes that he can help establish a world that's based on what he calls the four freedoms. And that's freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, which means you have your needs met, and freedom from fear. And so he wants to create a world based on these four things. And during this time period, he also meets with the British Prime Minister, and they meet in the Atlantic Ocean on a warship. And basically, they put together this pact called the Atlantic Charter. And the Atlantic Charter says that if the United States gets involved, we're not seeking to gain territory. We want freedom of the seas, and we want to end war. We're not in this to gain things. Okay, we're in this to keep peace and to keep freedom alive. And so this kind of Atlantic Charter, this meeting between FDR, the British Prime Minister. This becomes the foundation for what is later known as the United Nations, this coming together of countries to try to keep peace in the world. So not only is the United States on the verge of going into war in Europe to help the British and to defeat the Germans and the Nazi aggression, but the U.S. is also having kind of tense relations with the Japanese during this time period, because Japan is starting to industrialize, and when a country industrializes, they need resources. They need raw materials. And Japan also wanted to become a world power, an imperial power in Asia. They wanted to replace the Europeans in Asia and then become the regional power of Asia. And so here's a series of steps Japan takes. In 1931, they invade Manchuria, which is part of China, to try to gain resources, gain power. In 1937, they invade the rest of China. In 1941, they take over Indochina, so they take over that peninsula, that area, trying to gain resources. And so FDR says, all right, Japan, you should not be doing this. You should not be expanding, taking over other countries, taking over other places' resources. So FDR decides he's going to freeze all Japanese assets, and he's going to cut trade between the U.S. and Japan to try to hurt them economically, try to pressure them into backing off. FDR offered, he said, hey, if you withdraw from China and Indochina, we will resume trade talks, we will unfreeze assets. We just want you to back up a little bit. Well, Japan refused. So Japan they're in war mode, they're taking over, they want to become the power in Asia. And so they see Indonesia, and Indonesia has oil. And they need oil for the war effort. Japan doesn't have a lot of resources. They don't have a lot of oil. And so they want to take over Indonesia for the oil. And they know that if they attack Indonesia and try to take over Indonesia, the U.S. is going to respond and get involved, because the U.S. has already frozen their assets, has already cut off trade, and they know that if they go and take over Indonesia, they're going to get the U.S. involved. And so they decide that they need to take out the U.S. first. They need to attack the U.S. They need to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet so that they can take over Indonesia and they can have time to meet their objectives and their goals before the U.S. can respond. So on December 7th of 1941, there's two waves of Japanese airplanes that attack the U.S. Pacific Fleet that was stationed at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. So the attack sank and severely damaged a lot of U.S. ships, 18. 260 U.S. planes were damaged and destroyed, and 6,000 Americans were killed in the attacks. So the next day, FDR goes to Congress and asks them to declare war on Japan for these attacks on the United States. So, U.S. declares war on Japan. 4 days after the U.S. declares war on Japan, Germany and Italy declare war on the U.S. And so when Germany and Italy declare war on the U.S. declares war back on them. And so now the U.S. is involved fully in World War II, and we're involved on two fronts. We're involved in the Pacific against the Japanese, and we're involved in Europe against Italy and Germany.